So we've got an exciting group of panelists here to talk about assessment and how imperative assessment is and how it can help shape the education system and the challenges we currently face. I would like to invite each of the panelists in a minute to introduce themselves, but just briefly on myself, the least interesting character on stage. I'm an associate partner from McKinsey based in our New York office. I look after our investors and service providers community in North America. I'm also spent 10 years as a maths teacher, administrator, and on the board of a special educational needs school before moving to McKinsey. So I'd like to go down the line and ask each of you just to introduce yourself, your work in this space, and then what makes you particularly passionate about this subject.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michelle Odemwingie. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit organization, the Achievement Network. And as an organization, we focus on how do we ensure we have the highest quality assessments in schools, and more importantly, how do we ensure that all the educators and adults who are getting those insights feel empowered on how they take action in their own instructional behaviors to change the outcomes for students. In my own way of profession is also a math teacher, so middle school math teachers, those are my favorite people. If you're one of those, let's connect. I see y'all, special people that can do that work. And when I think about why this matters, particularly this conversation, is I believe that assessments are the tail that wags the dog in education. What happens in assessments, what we choose to do, what content we decide to put in them is what ultimately shapes a lot of the decisions that happen in schools and ultimately impact our communities.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Feuer. I'm the CEO and co-founder at Panorama Education. We serve now about 15 million students across the U.S., focused on school climate, social emotional learning, and getting more students on track for college and career readiness. And I think in the assessment space, something that we do a lot of work with schools on is helping to measure and assess school climate. Do students feel safe? Do they belong? Are they building adult relationships? As well as social emotional learning. And then using that data in conjunction with academic assessments, English, math, and so forth. And I think for today, what I'm really interested in, I love the tail wagging the dog, I think is top of mind for me as well, but how we think about what a well-rounded set of assessments looks like and how do we make sure that we are assessing not just part of a child, but assessing the whole child and making sure that we understand every dimension of school, how we're performing, and how that drives academic success for students.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caroline Wylie, and I am a scientist at Educational Testing Service. I'm in the K-12 Teaching, Learning, and Assessment Center. Most of my work has been centering around formative assessment for the last, 15 years or so. I was a math teacher by training when I was in Belfast, so another math teacher to join the crew here. And I am passionate about the work that I do in formative assessment because it sits at the intersection between what students are doing in class and what teachers are doing and what they need to know in order to help students identify what they know and can do, and then help students move forward in their own learning. And so this intersection between teacher knowing and teacher practice, and then student knowing and student practice, I think is just so important.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jamie Candee. I'm the CEO of Edmentum. We serve just over 6 million students here in the U.S., and our focus is the intersection of assessment and instruction. So from an assessment perspective, we focus on formative, interim, diagnostic assessments and how they tie into instructional practices and content. The core of the company for 60 years has been curriculum and instruction. What makes this discussion, you had asked, unique or what we're excited about, I have led both high-stakes testing companies and now low-stakes testing companies, so I have a perspective on both from the accountability summative perspective as well as what's happening in the classrooms and then from a district's perspective, so looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So thank you, guys. So jump in with our first question, and maybe just a bit of context on this one. So as we know, the last 12 to 18 months have been particularly challenging for our students. And a recent report, and there's many reports on this, but just to reference one that our company looked at with iReady, was that the average student at the beginning of this academic year was 4 months behind in maths and 3 months behind in reading. So I'd like to ask the panelists, and I'll maybe start with Caroline, is what role should assessment play in tackling unfinished learning in our post-pandemic education system?
Yeah. So, not surprisingly, I guess, given the work I've been doing, I think it's going to center around formative assessment. I think the summative assessments, the information we're getting from the like of iReady and other studies is important to let us know that, yes, unsurprisingly, the pandemic has had an impact on student learning. But now we need teachers to be empowered to think about how do I meet student learning and move that forward. So there's got to be that opportunity to say, what is it that the students are bringing to this particular lesson? What are the range of understandings that they already have, and how does that social sharing of what they already know support the learning of the class as a whole? And then having identified some of the unfinished learning opportunities, then the teacher's in the position to move that learning forward. But it's going to start with assessment, but it's got to start with that assessment that is at a fine-grained size that's actionable, not students are not doing well at algebra. That we know, and we know that the students that are probably struggling with algebra are the ones that have been marginalized and struggling historically. So that fine-grained, what is it that they are struggling specifically that this lesson is going to move them forward with is important.
Thank you. And maybe inviting Jamie, if you have any other comments to add to that.
So I think your last comment is a really good one, which is the question that we need to ask and we need to be talking about is when we talk about 4 months, 6 months of unfinished learning, which students? Because there are many populations of students across this country where that's simply not true, right? So the kids who already were in communities and environments where we had a challenge in terms of proficiency, literacy, that was perpetuated with COVID. And there are many areas, suburbs and others where it was not. And so I think, you know, we talk a lot about like, how do we actually dissect this information? And we are saying a lot, all of us at this conference and others, you know, we're talking about COVID learning loss and unfinished learning. We have always had these issues, right? So the question is, what are we going to do about it, right? And how do we start to differentiate the way we talk about the way we're going to address some of the different challenges that we're having and where kids are at based on zip code and other, you know, challenges that they have in learning opportunities. So because our primary focus is really what we do once you have the data, once the measurement has been done, now we figure out from an intervention perspective and an acceleration perspective, what are we going to do about it? Our focus right now has been on working with educators to say, you have the information, we've got the tools now, right? We know that we have the tools in place, and many of us on the stage are building those tools. How do we help the educators be prepared and feel comfortable that you can actually start to group students in a way where learning acceleration actually can happen in a amount of time that is assures that we can get kids caught up that need us right now to be focusing on them. So the only thing I'd say is like we see all this data coming out. We should question some of the data, and we should talk about like where is that happening and how, and was it happening before? Because I feel like we're just saying a different thing for the same problem that has existed for a long time. So.
And I see you nodding your head, Aaron. I don't know if you want to jump on to anything on that or anything you want to emphasize from the work you do.
Yeah, I might pull on. I like this thread of sort of dissecting and kind of looking at the information we have. I think what's interesting in this moment is understanding that how many different root causes can be behind the symptom or a data point that we see about, I think we have to go beyond, it's not about a student being low in algebra, but we look at a student who, for example, is struggling with fractions and understanding kind of in this moment, what is behind that? Is it unfinished learning? Is it a student actually who, has lost their sense of self-efficacy in school and doesn't think, I can learn because I haven't been learning for a period? I was talking to someone at the conference today who was telling me about her son's experience who had access to a standing desk at home and now was at school and expected to sit still in one place and was really struggling to learn in that environment. And I think what I hope in this moment is that we're able to sort of see, both these data points about where a student's learning is at, but also think holistically about what are the factors that are driving what we're seeing from a student and what are kind of the holistic set of needs that could be, in addition to academic instruction, part of the intervention and support that a student needs. And I wonder kind of how we can get this holistic picture about what a student is kind of behind this assessment data point that we might see about a child.
Fantastic. And just to complete the first question, Michelle, if you want to add anything to that.
I feel bad that I'm going last because I have a more controversial stance. I actually, at our organization, we don't use the phrase unfinished learning because it puts the blame and the onus on the child. It's actually teaching that didn't get finished. Learning, my learning is unfinished, right? Like I'm sitting on this panel hearing you all talk. My learning's ongoing. There's the premise or putting out the idea that learning ends or your understanding about fractions ends. right? Like my understanding about fractions is still growing and still like evolving. And so when we say like unfinished learning, the burden then is on the child that they are not complete. It kind of introduces this efficacy issue versus we weren't finished, right? We didn't get to finish our lessons. We didn't get to finish some concepts that we were teaching, but students were learning. Every student, no matter where they were in the past 18 months, whether we could find them or not, they were learning something. And they were learning something about this world, they were learning something about the content. And so now it's about actually how do we acknowledge that there's concepts we have not had a chance to get to, but the student is coming to us complete as they can possibly be. And it's our job and our responsibility to harness the learning that's happened and apply it to the areas where they need to continue to learn and grow.
I think that's a very fair point, and thanks for picking me up on my maybe loose language around the learning.
Well, and it's not you, it's all of us, right? The space continually uses language that faults the child, and it's about how do we actually put the responsibility where it belongs, which is on the educators.
And actually, maybe it's a perfect segue. If the responsibility is on educators, and as Jamie mentioned, there's lots of data out there, there's lots of studies out there, we know there's a gap. Maybe, Aaron, I would want to invite you to talk a little bit about how do we use this data? I know the work you're doing at Panorama now about supporting schools and districts to understand the data they have, and obviously the phrase data rich and insight poor is often used. Like, how should we use data in school? How should we go from knowing there's a problem to then getting it to tackle the unfinished teaching, as we're now labeling it?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I think since I also like kind of the language question for us of like sort of how do we frame from we've got a bunch of problems to sort of just what is the current state of where we are. Like I think one of the biggest truths now, which was true before as well, but is this idea that every student is in a different place, has their own story, has their own experience, and there's a story about every student, a story about every teacher, a story about the school environment, how it's coming back together. And for me, what I think a lot about of the role of data in this moment can be to kind of help us understand that story most completely. And what I mean by that is kind of reframing from, it's easy to be caught up in like systems and like red, yellow, green, where's the student, what it is, to kind of, there's now a story. And the story, I think, for a student can include a story of gaps or problems, which I really don't want to use that language. It's a story of assets, of strengths, of resilience, of opportunities. And I think to me, like I like this idea of just picking up kind of, hey, let's understand exactly where we are now. I even, it's interesting, I even wrestle with like this, unfinished teaching because I don't know if our teachers need more pressure around like, hey, I didn't finish my teaching. And so I'm sort of thinking, I've been thinking more about like how we reframe some of our previous data systems that were very much about kind of rigorous accountability, diagnostics, et cetera, which can be really important into this question about just like what is the story of now? How do we learn from it? And we look at the story to figure out what are the strengths we're going to celebrate. How do we build efficacy in teachers and students and kind of build from there? And so it's a little mushy about the story, but I think it actually can be a powerful way of reframing what data is right now.
Yeah, and I think it's really important on the topic of reframing, especially when you're trying to move away from like a kind of accountability towards pushing for progress. Does anyone else want to come on that and talk about data? Maybe something that'd be quite interesting here, what role do parents have to play in this and engaging parents in this? Because it's a community problem that we want to tackle together. Does anyone want to talk on that point?
I'll get started. I think it's partly why we spend so much of our time actually focused on how you're going to use the data and how you support educators in making quality choices. Because the reality is, particularly for students who've had to be traditionally resilient in their education system because the system has denied them access and marginalized them, data has been weaponized against them, right? Data for communities that I'm from, the communities we serve, is what decides where we get funding or not, what determines what closed down our schools, how we lose jobs. And so data is a weapon. And data from assessments is used actively weaponized against students. And so it's about how we think about this moment right now and saying, what is the way in which we leverage data as a tool of empowerment? And how do we ensure that data is put into the hands of people who can rewrite that story, right? And I think there's a couple of things that I've been observing that I think kind of illustrate where we've gone wrong and where I hope we can go in this moment. So one, I oftentimes see, there's this great Cornel West quote. He says, rich kids are taught, poor kids are tested. And the reality is, even for us, a lot of districts are calling us unfinished learning, learning loss. We're going to need a lot more diagnostics. I'm like, to tell you what? You already know. The children were behind before, to your point before. Like, is this a new problem? Like we're not gonna get a different insight or perspective if you just kind of keep measuring and measuring and measuring. We spend more time like assessing the students than time actually analyzing the insights to say, what can we all do differently? So that's one thing. And then I think it's also this, like, accountability is this big, scary concept and word of like, oh no, well, we don't want accountability. But I'm like, it's not, accountability isn't wrong. It's like, who are we accountable to? If we look at data and say, I'm accountable to the young person who shared with me what they know and what they need, I'm accountable to them, then accountability is awesome. Right? If accountability is like, I'm accountable to some person in government who's gonna make a decision that's weaponized against me, then it's scary, right? And I think if we kind of can flip in terms of engaging communities, engaging parents, and saying, we're accountable to you. Because the biggest trust exercise that anybody does, if anybody has a child, when you go drive up to your school and let your precious baby walk out and be with other adults for 8 hours is the biggest trust exercise. And I can't believe y'all do it every day. I only got a dog, and he's at doggy daycare, and I got a call, and I was already stressed out, right? But that's a huge trust exercise. And so it's like, well, I'm accountable to you that you're trusting me to do right by your baby. Then that's the way you bring parents into the conversation versus I'm bringing data to report back to you in a way that can feel judgy or like you're not enough, your student's not enough, when actually it's like we together as a community have more work to do.
I think about it in a really practical way. We've talked about this. So a lot of the work that we do with our districts is data coaching, data evaluation. But here's the thing that, so if you just take yourself out of what we're talking about right now and just think about all of us, you're building organizations, running organizations, you're in leadership positions. Think of how many times in a day you think about what is the purpose of this data that I'm looking at. And then imagine being an educator, being in a classroom, being a parent, and just constant flows of new and different data because of the flavor of the month being introduced to you and trying to interpret what that actually means, right? Like, I think about that all the day long in our organizations, right? It's like, what is the purpose of this data? For those of us that are working with schools and trying to improve systems, it is really important that we stop just flooding the market, you're just flooding schools with here's more data, here's this data, you can do this thing, and like sit down and actually understand what data they're using and why, and help them actually infer like what is the important pieces of this data that will help us improve instruction, and what is the purpose of each of these assessments. Because what's happening right now is the number of like, now we need this diagnostic, and now we're gonna do this thing, and like when you actually add up how many different tests, when it's a school-based choice versus a district versus what the state wants everybody to do, it is unbelievable the amount of assessments that are flowing through the system right now, and nobody knows how to interpret it, right? And so like we gotta like slow down, like to your point, like you already know, like we already know what some of the issues are. Now you gotta dig in so we can figure out what the learning opportunity is and what that child actually needs, but we don't need more, stop adding to the layers and start stepping back and saying, like we all do, right, in our lives, like what is the purpose of this information and what am I gonna do with it, so. Yeah.
And I think what you were saying also about trust in the system and that trust between parents, but also between student and teacher, begins with, if I as the teacher am collecting information, I need to demonstrate to students that I'm going to do something with it, that I'm not just testing for grading or for other purposes, but that actually what I learn about you as a student is going to influence what happens next. And that also, I think, starts to support student efficacy in their own learning because they see that the adult in the room is invested in seeing what they do know and supporting their learning. And having that then use of assessment data flow through the system, that it's starting at formative, it's moving up through the others, and it's supporting the teachers, the administrators to have that critical conversation of, if we don't know that we just use this, that we do this diagnostic because it's Tuesday. If we don't know what we're doing with it, then we shouldn't be doing it. But I think modeling, I think some of the power of formative assessment, it is the lowest stakes. It's also the one that's happening all the time, we hope. So let's model those good assessment behaviors and then make sure that they're flowing through the other kinds of assessment that's happening in the school.
So I want to build on that point and maybe stepping back from the pandemic specifically and the challenges that faced. There's clearly kind of some thoughts that have been shared around the amount of data, the amount of testing. Maybe if I asked you, and I'll, we can see who wants to start first on this, is if you look at the US education system, considering the layers of assessment we have, formative, summative, all the way from the classroom to the school, the district, the state, two questions to this is, one, do we have the right amount of assessment? And is the mix between summative and formative right? Like, should we be approaching it completely differently and focusing much more on a formative piece? Should we be using, like, how would you restructure the kind of volume and like segmentation of how we're using assessment today? Who would like to start on that?
So I think there's a role for all of those assessments, or at least there's a role for those type of assessments. I think some type of summative accountability that's there to support decision makers making decisions about where do I deploy my coaches, what schools might need the additional help, what schools need additional resources. That's a decision that can be in part informed by some of those accountability assessments. But starting with the classroom assessment and what is the information I need to drive instruction towards meaningful learning goals, and not how can I make sure that I'm preparing students for this particular item type that's going to show up in an accountability assessment. But that is less the fault of the assessment. It's actually a genuine fear on the part of educators about the weaponization of that data. So I think part of the ways in which the system needs to change is different uses of the summative data. I don't want decision makers wanting to know every dot and tittle of formative data that's happening in the classroom, and I don't want teachers trying to decide how to drive their instruction based on an accountability assessment that's giving them 5 subscores. So different people need different information, and we need to have them talking together in the sense of, if we want to see meaningful and rich learning in the classroom, we might need to see some constructed response questions happening on an accountability assessment, because that is sending a signal about what we value. We can't just be valuing multiple choice items.
Anyone like to jump on?
I think, sure. I think it also comes back to this purpose-driven question about, like, what is the data we truly need and how are we going to use it? And I'm thinking, you know, I'm traveling back 2 years, which feels like maybe 16 years, to kind of, we were helping some districts kind of that were rethinking how they were using literacy screeners for middle elementary students. And I'm thinking about 2 districts. One district that had this vision for, you know, making sure that every student was on grade level in literacy, and their idea, their theory of action was that we want to make sure no student falls through the cracks, falls behind, and spend a decent amount of time administering a literacy screener to all of their students at certain grade marks 3 times a year, and we were helping them report back this data. And we realized that actually there was no intervention process for students who were off track, and so we were screening, but there wasn't a process for acting on that data. And in that district, in my view, that was kind of just a waste of time. Like, it gave us a really nice dashboard to tell us 25% of our kids were off track in literacy in 4th grade, but like, so what? And there was no decision process. Whereas a different district, which I really appreciated, had exactly the same process with a really rigorous MTSS process to make sure that every time a student was off track, they received literacy intervention, progress monitoring, and no child fell through the cracks. And their dashboard was actually the percentage of students who were off track and didn't get intervention was their KPI, and they wanted that to be 0. And we can, I think, we can debate the merits of like a screener MTSS-based progress monitoring system. I'm generally in favor of it, but I know there are different perspectives on that. But I think, you know, to me, the takeaway of this is that, like, there has to be a thoughtful system for acting on the data, and we have to kind of choose where we put our resources. And I think right now we don't have the resources to act on all the data that we're collecting, which makes me think that we need to kind of start deleting things, do a small number of assessments, do it really well, and actually maybe accept that different districts will choose different types of assessments, where I feel like right now we're expecting districts to do kind of the same genres of assessments in every place, but we're not acting on all of them well, and I wonder kind of what it looks like to say, hey, let's start with the basics about where we actually taking action, only do those assessments, and then add more over time in a way that doesn't erode this like accountability to the student. And I've been thinking about that. I would do have a chance now as we come out of COVID, whatever language we want to use there, like, do we have a chance to rethink and not just like put back all the before assessments, and instead like gradually add things back as we put resourcing to acting on the data, and sort of add things back one by one as we use it, as opposed to just restoring everything because unfinished learning requires us to test it all.
And I think, to build on that, Aaron, because I agree that in my ideal universe, we would start over because there's so much proliferation, we can't almost like get out of the muck. And I think my opinion on this probably has changed in the past 24 hours. Maybe it's like the sleep deprivation and high volume of human contact. But like right now I'm just like, what really is the purpose of a summative? Like that is the question I'm authentically grappling with for myself. I had the opportunity to talk to a few policymakers who are supposed to be making decisions from this, and they think teachers get data to inform instruction. And I'm like, oh no, boo-boo, they get that in November, the kids are gone, like you get these big, and I'm like, okay, so you all think that this is happening for teachers to make decisions. And I don't know any school that's actually using the data and insights that they get to change something from it. And when I go and look at, say, okay, if summatives are not really being used to drive anything, they do then dictate a lot of the other assessments that have been added, right? Like a lot of the times we get, a lot of people will call ANET and be like, we want an interim to predict how students are gonna perform on the summative. Which one, red flag. If you want me to tell you in October how kids are gonna do in May, you're telling me you don't wanna do your job. That's not how this works, right? And so that is one driver of why you pick assessments, or like I want benchmarks like in the middle of the year to see if students have gotten there. Or we all say that we know each child is different and their learning pathway is different, but by May you better all be the same. Like I'm just really grappling with like, who is summative serving authentically, and can we, with high quality formatives, like really ensuring that insights are given to teachers, can we move the system more than adding more summatives? Because the reality is the gaps are widening, students aren't performing better. So like all this summative that we've introduced is not served anybody well. Like no student is getting better because we've introduced it. So I'm very much in the like, can we start over? And I wonder, is this moment that like, it's been 2 years, we haven't really had summatives, the world didn't fall apart, like that we use that as the catalyst to start some change.
I'll just add to that. Yes, yeah, very good. Yeah. There are a couple of pilots running, Georgia, Nebraska. So you look at the work that NWA is doing, the through year, trying to implement more of an interim. The challenge, so I ran a summative company, and you know this, but you know, the psychometric community and the policymakers and educators all have to agree on how we're going to do this, because the easy thing for us to do is put these big expensive tests together that all the kids take in the spring. The test results don't come out in the summer because there is so much accountability tied to those results of the test that we can't get it wrong, right? So there is a ton of stuff that happens from spring into summer before we publish the proficiency levels, and then whatever happens from that point. So the data becomes useless by the time the kids come back to school, and then what do? We start with all our diagnostics, and then we do our universal screener, and we're doing all the things. And so the question is, how do we get those constituents, right, those groups, because it is possible to actually combine both. What I do think the value of summative is, if implemented, it's not, so for me it is, I think there's a purpose for it. I think we have gone down the wrong path when you start tying teacher evaluation and on all those different political things that we've dealt with. But if you look at like what other tests, because NAEP doesn't do this for every school in every district in every state for us to say, are we making progress or not? And if we're using it for that purpose, and then we're saying, so Mississippi is a really good example. If you look at what Dr. Carrie Wright has done over the last couple of years from a policy perspective, is actually taking those results and then building it into a multi-layered kind of interim structure with focused efforts on how you're going to try to use that data to improve outcomes. And they've been working on this in the department for years and years, but that's actually a really good model to look at. Tennessee has done some similar things. So I think I agree with everything you're saying. I think there are ways for us to get, but we have to, like the people who are building the tests, the people who are actually doing the measurement around it, and then the policymakers, everybody has to like sit down and actually like understand like what are we doing today, what is possible, and then what is the time frame by which we need our psychometric community to get really comfortable with the models that we could build to do more of a through year so we can use that data more meaningfully. So.
I think I told Aaron, was it you at breakfast? I told psychometricians hate me every time I talk to them. I'm like, you guys are making this really hard for all of us. They're like, well, we need all this validity. I'm like, to tell us that students are learning. Like, that's like, we're still at a nation at risk 30 years later. But like, yes, it's like, how do we figure out policy, psychometricians, everyone in the conversation? And oftentimes the person not in that conversation are students who are supposed to be served by it.
And I think doing, as we were saying earlier, like kind of doing it before, I think we spent a lot of time saying, hey, we gave out this test, how are we going to make this data useful on the back end of that, and how we actually do the intentional collaboration before. I feel like, I don't know what you mean, I think we get asked so much, like, hey, we gave out this assessment data, like help us report it back in a meaningful way, let's make the most out of it, we did this, and it's like, wait a second, we're having this conversation on the wrong end of this process. We got to do this at the top and get everyone in the room together at the top of the process.
what's stopping that happening now? Now, what's stopping districts coming together or states coming together? Like, what's the one bottleneck that you could cut to lubricate the system, make it work? What's that challenge? And that's open to anyone who wants to help us to.
Well, let's start with local control, right? So we've got, I mean, the system is not designed in terms of the way, the purview in which schools can and should and want to operate versus what districts want versus states, right? It's not aligned, right? So in very few states it's aligned. I think where you have really strong leadership, where there is collaboration between Department of Education and the districts in terms of a common purpose of how we, like you will see states that make a ton of progress when you have that kind of unified leadership. But I think just in general, right, you're gonna have, teachers are gonna, formative assessment, right, is in the moment. It is there to inform instruction, to support kids here and now, right? And that has a very specific purpose. And teachers do not want us coming in and telling them, like, now we're going to give you this big bloated system that the district has adopted, and you're going to give up everything that you know works for kids, right? So it's a cycle like that. And I think, but there are, you know, you told us to plan for talking about those hero moments. And I think when we get to the end, there are a lot of models where it is working from a state to a district to a local level. Maybe we talk about those at the end. But I think by nature, the system is not designed to be congruent in terms of like how we get each layer of the system to work together to make it a more fluid ecosystem.
I think, I promise I'm not normally a contrarian, but I think that like the number one challenge is we're not very honest about education in our country. And what I'm trying to find a way to say is like, how do I say this? Oftentimes I'll hear from a teacher like, oh, well, I know what works. And I'm like, based on what evidence? Because your students haven't performed, like we chronically haven't served students well, right? And so I think there's something about like us having more honesty in our system about like, we've tried a lot of interventions. We've tried a lot of national adjustments and they aren't working. Like the needle, look at the NAEP scores, like the needle is not moving. And when it moves down. And if we were in healthcare, and like mortality rates were at the rate in which literacy rates are, it would be a crisis, right? We would be like losing our minds. Or if you were a business and your profit rates were like hitting decline, you'd be fired, right? Like we just don't have this like orientation towards authentic honesty for ourselves that like we are not serving students well. I dare say sometimes it's because the students who are not being served most by the system, we don't authentically view ourselves accountable to them, and I have the belief that we blame them for why they're not performing well. But if we like really viewed it in that way, I think then we'd be able to ask ourselves more expansive questions, because a lot of times we're like just tinkering, and we're like tinkering, like if we just change this, if we just adjust this purpose, if we just make this thing show up on a Promethean board, like all of the problems will be solved, but it's like we're not looking at this as like a real authentic crisis that sits in front of us, particularly because for a lot of decision makers, for a lot of even assessment designers, the students who are most harmed by it don't represent those who make decisions by it. I often say, like, oftentimes there's conversations around, you know, when people talk about whole child, what I respect and love about Aaron is when he says whole child, he actually means it. Like academics doesn't get erased from the conversation. And sometimes I'll sit in conversations and people say like, well, we just need more whole child and that will solve all the challenges for the community. And I'm like, well, race can make conversations around rigor irrelevant for some communities. But for the communities we serve, I need them to have high quality, rigorous content. I need that to be a guarantee. They have to learn literacy because that is the only antidote to poverty in this country. And if we viewed it like that, I think we would be more expansive in our ideation. And so I think the barrier is like honesty. Like we're not really honest with ourselves about how much the challenge that we're facing and how much we have failed solving it.
So, thank you. And on this topic of solving challenges, I think one thing that I want to make sure we get into in the last 5 minutes is the other big challenge in education, aside from the kind of the challenge of progress for all, is those certain communities that are held back from progress particularly. And if you look at lower income groups, if you look at certain ethnic groups, not only were they hit hardest by the pandemic, and not only in the data that's already been shown are they furthest behind, but that was already the case pre-pandemic. So my question to you, as we're talking about the things that we could do to fix the system, and it's the last question before we get to the summary question, is what's your opinion on the state of assessment and how fairly it represents communities in the US? How fairly it is equitable to communities across the income scale and across the kind of, the racial groups as well? I know I've talked to all of you about this individually, so who would like to start?
I think assessment's going through a reckoning, as many communities are in many conversations in the last 2 years. And so there are questions to be asked of who's reflected in the assessment, who's writing the passages that students are being asked to read and answer comprehension questions about. Are they being exposed to both stories that reflect their own experiences and stories that reflect experiences of other students that they know and other communities? So I think that's a question. I think it's a question of who's writing the questions. It's who's involved in reviewing them, who gets to say when a question is fair or not fair, and what does that mean? So, I think the assessment community is asking a lot of questions of itself and needs to continue those and bring other people into the conversation. That certainly at ETS we're having conversations about what it means to be culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, and can an assessment, I think an assessment can be culturally relevant. I think we're still asking questions of, can it be responsive and sustaining, or does that need a person to be in the action? That's a teacher can take on those roles, but maybe not the assessment. But as we need to look to both the literature and the people that are doing the work in those areas to then inform what we're doing in assessment and help us learn from that work.
I think we're in a pretty dark moment, not just on assessment, but from a curriculum perspective. So we deal with this daily. So what we deem as culturally responsive in Texas, we will be annihilated versus what we do in California. And so literally our curriculum designers and our learning engineer, literally every day we have states, districts, school boards telling us, take this item out, change this, if you're watching school board meetings right now, it's probably the most toxic time I can remember in the amount of time I've been doing this work. And so I think for us, it's a call to action in terms, the work you're doing. What I love is when you look at organizations like ETS, like NWA, nonprofits, who have the bandwidth and the funding and the infrastructure to do this research, to help those of us that are serving directly into the districts, to be able to leverage that, because we need it. Because right now we're being pulled into all the politics, everywhere, and every state, right, is going through this in different ways. And so I think my personal opinion is we're in a really dark moment right now, and we need to get out of it. And I question how long it's going to take for us to work through this. And we could actually have a whole panel on this discussion here alone. But that's what I would say. So it's, for us, the way that we address it is the only way we know how to do this is we have values and we have purpose in terms of what we do at Edmentum, but we also have a platform and we have curriculum and we have assessment systems that are really flexible. And so what we've asked states to take on is then you have to customize, you have to take on some of this work in terms of how you're going to modify this, because you can't, we have a model, right? We have an instructional, we have a learning design model, we have our beliefs, we have a position that we've taken, and we're not going to keep changing it for every school board meeting that comes back, right? So that's been kind of our last 6 months, and it's going to continue, I think, and it's a real challenge, so.
Do you want to give anyone else want to respond to that? We are running out of time. And I actually think the time is a disservice to the quality of the panelists, because there's 1,000 questions I could ask you around many
It's not
topics.
serving all students well.
Yeah. Yes.
And let me
Go on.
be able to sneak in also that I think it's a challenge to us about how we can use data from assessments to tell honest stories about inequities, but also not to tell deficit-based stories about kids. And I think it's interesting, right? But I've seen a lot of assessment product demos. If you look at the demo data, we always see the black kids are lowest performing in the demo data constructed by the company in the assessment data, right? And it's interesting, right? And I understand the intention behind that probably is showing inequities in the systems. But then there's a chance that we have, which is important. And I'm not talking about people on the stage, by the way, but I think it's important. There's a chance that we have, as we think about assessments for equity, how we can make sure that we tell asset-based stories about students and make data something that can be uplifted and not weaponized, and that we can tell real, honest conversations about equity, but also not in a way way that like makes kids feel that they're coming from a deficit perspective through test data.
So I'm just kind of looking puppy-eyed at the boss over there to see if I can get an extra 2 minutes. So last 2 minutes, and I think there's so many ideas on the stage, and you know, you've probably spoken or heard of the panelists before today. But I'd love to invite each of the panelists to just take 30 seconds to just share a positive hero story that you've heard where assessment's really gone well. So we can end on a positive about what is good in an education system that we can learn from and build from. We spent plenty of time pointing out some of the challenges. So I'll just go down the line and start with you, Michelle, if you want to share your hero story.
Yeah, one, there's thousands of them. They're everywhere in every school, in every classroom, in every community. There's ways and moments in which assessments are being used for good and to inform instruction. I think a lot about this school, Minor Elementary in Washington, D.C. I was coaching them around their data about 10 years ago. And Minor had a story in the city that was one of underperforming, not in the right neighborhood, never seeing the right test results or scores. And they had a community of teachers there that were obsessed at improvement for themselves. We hosted PD series, and Minor Elementary had 100% attendance to every session we had. And what was really powerful is at the end of the year, we were reading a third grade constructive response. And reading we were just doing a blind review to see how our school's doing. And we read this beautiful written response from a third grader about Maya Angelou's Still I Rise poem, and said the author is using repetition to convey the primary theme. I'm like, third grade? And then I go and we flip it over, and it's from Minor Elementary. And what they had been found a way to do was take what they were seeing from the assessments and the insights that they were getting to find ways to have higher quality conversations with their students. When we interviewed that student, she said, oh, well, my teacher knows we can get better. That's why I did really well this year. Miss Gunter, she believes that we can do really well. So every time I write, I want to write the best answer because I know she believes. And I'm like, that's the power of a person using formative assessments, changing the story for a student versus just assuming that the story of Minor was going to be the story forever.
I'm thinking just a different direction. Another story I love, which is we were working with Clark County, Nevada, Las Vegas during the pandemic, and they're having a conversation about what are the assessments we want to run, what data do we need, exactly the right conversation of let's start square zero, what do we actually need to know? And they realized they were having serious issues with student mental health and had actually seen a spate of student suicides, and realized what they actually wanted to act on was mental health information about students, and that was their number one, quote unquote, I'm going to broaden assessment need. And so we, ran an assessment across the district, which was simply one of the questions we asked students was, do you wish to talk to a counselor or a psychologist at your school about your mental health and well-being? And it was a one-question assessment, and if you said yes, you got a Zoom telehealth visit from one of your school counselors or psychologists. 35,000 kids raised their hand in response to that question. And again, I don't want to celebrate the high number, but we surfaced that. And they made that happen. And that was a very simple, very low touch, high information, driven by priorities, and they acted on it. And that to me was just phenomenal to see and expanded the definition about what assessment's gotta be.
So when I think of a hero, I think of a principal in the UCLA school system who supports her teachers to be teacher leaders and has organized her school day that allows those teachers to spend half their time teaching students and teaching them phenomenally well, but also spending half their time supporting other teachers in the school develop their own formative assessment practices. And so I think that ability to provide support for teachers to be the best that they can be in their formative assessment practices, that principal is a hero.
I know we're way over time, so very quickly, Acceleration Academies are dropout recovery centers. They're in Clark County, Miami-Dade, all over the country. They're phenomenal. So these are kids who have aged out of the system, specific state. This is a way that I think assessment is used really well, which is mastery-based learning. So the only way these kids get back into the system and actually get a diploma and able to graduate is through a competency-based model, right? So you assess what they already know, and then you put them through the curriculum that they didn't know, you help them master, they move on, and they actually get a diploma. So if you want to see a great story, thousands of kids have graduated through this program. It's all over the country. Look up Acceleration Academies.
Fantastic. Some great stories there. And I'd like to thank you again for running over. Thank you again for being patient. And can we thank our panelists, please?